across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View, and it is also the last day of our fiscal year, probably the last day for a fiscal year of a number of different ministries. So even though we'll certainly be asking you to support us, and a little bit later I'll be talking with Chuck Bentley, who is, of course, with Crown Financial, and encouraging you maybe to support them as well. Nevertheless, the bottom line is this is the last day for us, and we have, as we mentioned before, a $100,000 matching fund that all came together at the last moment. This is kind of a hill we've never had to climb before, but so far so good. I think I heard somebody say, more than $40,000 has been given or pledged towards that. So that is really good and really amazing. But nevertheless, I will get to that a little bit later. And just to give you an overview, we're going to be talking with Bill Dotson about Abiding Fathers Ministry at the bottom of the hour. How relevant is that in light of even yesterday, the conversation with Colonel Allen West saying one of the biggest issues facing first the African-American population, but I think America in general, is the absence of fathers. So we'll talk about that, the need for fathers to, first of all, be involved, and then also to encourage fathers that are involved to do better. And then Chuck Bentley, as I mentioned, will be with us really about an hour and a half from now, as we'll talk about stewardship. He's got a really good piece here that talks about the next pandemic and some of the issues that we might talk about, preparing for another pandemic, and just some wise ideas there. And then at 2:15, we have Representative Louie Gohmert with us. We'll talk about everything from the coronavirus to issues of deportation, immigration number. Those may seem unrelated. They will be more relevant. One, because he's been writing about that and speaking about that, too, because some of the peaks in the various coronavirus and COVID-19 have happened at the border, so we'll get into some of those questions as well. But let me, if I can, talk about a Supreme Court decision today, which is another one of these positive decisions for religious liberty. But as I do that, we'll talk about what it means. I think I will also, as we go through this, help you understand why I hope you listen to Point of View, because I'm appalled at how poorly the press has covered this so far. I mean, again, it just came out, but I wrote a column. Let's go see. I wrote a column in February on this. So it's not like we didn't know this decision was coming down. February 3rd, 2020, if you want to go back and find my column, which is entitled The End of Blaine. And you're going to say, how does that relate? Well, you have to read 10 paragraphs into USA Today, so I'll give them partial credit for them finally to admit what this really was all about, which is called the Blaine Amendment. I'll explain that in just a minute. But let's just look at the Associated Press article that talks about the fact that Supreme Court today said that states must allow religious schools to participate in programs that provide scholarships to students attending private schools. So the idea is if you provide a scholarship, and you can go to a private school, then you can't disqualify that private school if it happened to be a Christian private school. And so the decision is kind of the latest in this whole area of free exercise. As you've heard me talk about before with Kelly Shackelford, most of these First Amendment issues are establishment of religion cases. This was a free exercise one. The person who wrote the majority, okay, we like what he said this time, Chief Justice John Roberts, wrote that a state need not subsidize private education, but once states decide to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they're religious, which makes sense. The case, which I'll describe a little bit more, goes back to Montana, in which it was providing parental and student choice in education and allowed individuals to have a grant to actually go and deal with this in one way or the other. And yet what prevented this from happening in Montana was the remnants of what's called the Blaine Amendment in the state constitution. So it was a great opportunity to maybe finally end this very hostile kind of view. The decision, of course, was one that was not saying that they have to provide funding for religious education. It simply said that once you provide it for private education, you can't disqualify a religious group. And so, to me, without getting into all the details, it's really pretty simple. And the example I used for my wife this morning is, after World War II, we had the GI Bill. A lot of us around the table had parents or grandparents who went and had the GI Bill. And then the GI Bill was given to them to go to college. And it didn't matter if you went to the University of Texas or SMU, which is Methodist, or Notre Dame, which was Catholic, or you went to Vanderbilt, which had another denominational distinction. It didn't matter because, again, the GI Bill allowed you to put that particular funding at whatever university you went to. This is the same idea. If you're going to provide resources for parents to get private education, you can't simply say, well, it's got to be secular private education. It can't be religious private education and all the rest. Now, the response from the dissent, I'll just quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was, well, petitioners may still send their kids to a religious school. There simply are no scholarship funds to be had. In other words, yeah, well, we're not telling you can't go to a religious school, but we aren't going to actually let you have the same benefits as somebody else that wants to go to maybe a secular private school. And so, again, to give at least partial credit, maybe one cheer, that's about all you're going to get out of this, USA Today, by the time you get down to the 10th Amendment, you have a quote, which is from, I suspect, Chief Justice Roberts. The Blaine Amendment was born of bigotry and arose at a time of prevailing hostility to the Catholic Church and to Catholics in general. But many of the state counterpoints have similarly shameful pedigree. Now, first of all, how many people even know what the Blaine Amendment is? I know right now, if I even walked out of the studio and asked even people in this ministry and certainly down the hallway and in this building what the Blaine Amendment is, all of them go, I don't know. The Blaine Amendment is to Catholics kind of what Jim Crow was to African Americans. The Blaine Amendment was passed as an attempt to prevent any kind of possible, even indirect funding of Catholic schools. There was sort of a very definite anti-Catholic bias that existed for some time, and there was really an attempt to put the Blaine Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, if you can believe it. Since it failed, there were individuals that decided that they would still implement it because it never really got the 3/4 of the states to adopt it, but many of the states decided anyway to put it in their state constitution, hence the conversation about Montana. And so what was argued is that in the Montana's constitution, it prohibits public funds from being spent on sectarian purposes. Back in the 19th century, when this was first passed, sectarian meant Catholic schools. And so Montana just simply applied it to any so-called Christian school. But, of course, it is in direct contradiction to other Supreme Court decisions. There's one called Trinity Lutheran and a variety of others. And that one in particular said you can't keep a Christian school from applying for a federal grant to get playground resurfacing just because it's a Christian school. And this should not have been controversial. It is always amazing to me that you can depend on 4 liberals to vote against anything, even if it makes sense, simply because it's not what the National Education Association actually would call for. And so we'll come back. I'll give you just a couple more points on that and move on. But if nothing else, this issue of the Blaine Amendment, maybe it's dead finally. And yet you wouldn't know anything about that if you weren't listening to Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, the president of iVoter Guide explained on my radio program how COVID shows how elections matter. Debbie Withnow said that COVID reminds us that elected officials can make life and death decisions. Now, it may be tempting to think that elections are just politics. We learn from various orders and pronouncements, however, by elected officials that they have significant power over our lives. She also argued that COVID revealed how vulnerable our religious liberties are. Some elected officials singled out church services for special sanctions. Legal organizations were busy trying to defend churches. Also related was the reality that COVID revealed how vulnerable our civil liberties are. A lone surfer was fined. Police ticketed 22 people in cars watching the sunset. A man was arrested for playing t-ball with his 6-year-old daughter in a park. On the other hand, she noted COVID also showed us that many officials still support religious and civil liberties. Many elected officials pushed back against the irresponsible edicts. Judges even struck down some of the most blatant acts of bullying. Unfortunately, politicians use the pandemic crisis to stuff special interest pork into laws meant to help average Americans. These bills were also used to funnel money to wealthy universities and the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. COVID also showed that politicians' worldview matters. We all agree that saving the lives of the elderly and at-risk people is something the government should do, but that same concern for life did not extend to the unborn. Abortion clinics were kept open because they were considered essential services. The pandemic was a reminder of how important the November elections will be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes, let me just mention this case out of the Supreme Court because I think it's fairly significant. Kelly Shackelford thinks so. Here's what he said. Again, today, the Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution prevents the government from treating religious organizations and schools unequally. The justices made it clear that states cannot legally discriminate against religious organizations when they perform the same work secular institutions do. This is a victory for religious liberty, and I would completely agree. John Hartley actually said that this decision today is unquestionably a win for school choice movement. He says it also turns out that Hoover Institute's Thomas Sowell, who I've been quoting quite a bit lately, has a book on school choice. It comes out today. Not only that, Thomas Sowell is 90 years of age. My goodness. And he is just as lucid and as compelling as ever. So anyway, something to mention. First of all, three cheers for the Supreme Court, especially because if you go back to my February issue in which I wrote my commentary, I was fearful that the Supreme Court might just decide not to decide. We've seen this a lot. And part of the problem is that after Montana's ruling was challenged, then they decided, the state of Montana decided that they would no longer actually issue a scholarship. So then they could actually say, well, then there's really no reason to consider this case because there's no issue at default. Now, fortunately, the Supreme Court said, yes, but you denied 3 different mothers and their children the opportunity to have access to that scholarship, which, by the way, was not very extreme at all. You know, there are days when you just sometimes wonder, why are even people fighting about this? Because one of them, I think, was like $500. Yeah, the $500 tuition scholarship. So we're fighting over $500. But the point, it's, as we say so often, it's the principle of the matter. And yet the principle goes both ways. Lots of times when somebody gets really upset about an issue that I've said, I'll say, wait a minute. I don't think it's that big a deal. The fact that you think it's a big deal means I better stay engaged in this debate because I want to kind of figure out where this is taking you. But nevertheless, this was a great illustration of, first of all, we had the case known as Trinity Lutheran in Colorado, which simply said, oh, no, I guess, excuse me, that was in Missouri. That particular case had to do with a Christian school. They just applied for a federal grant for playground resurfacing. They take all these tires, tear them up, and they make great material for a playground. And they were denied because they were a Christian school. And you're saying, well, kids that are on a playground, doesn't matter if it's a Christian school or a secular school, we don't want them to get hurt. And so the Supreme Court ruled that just because you're a Christian school doesn't mean you can't receive a federal grant. This is the same sort of thing in which it simply says that, look, this Blaine Amendment did more harm than good. It was an indefinite, bigoted attempt to try to prevent any possible funding of Christian schools. Back then, it was just Catholic schools by, in many cases, Protestants. And it is certainly something that should never have been pushed forward. It's never should have been in any of these state constitutions. And here we are in 2020 talking about discrimination. Finally, maybe it's being dealt with. So, nevertheless, just wanted to mention that the Supreme Court decision that came down today is something that is very significantly positive in terms of religious liberty. But it also, I think, illustrates only so well why in just a few minutes I'm going to encourage you to think about what you might want to do to support this ministry, because I don't imagine that you're going to get anything close to the kind of explanation I just gave to you a few minutes ago anywhere else, maybe not even in some of the conservative talk shows, but certainly not in the mainstream media. But just before we take a break, you know as well as I do that there is just an incredible push right now to tear down the statues. I've got this growing list here. We've got George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses S. Grant, of course, Winston Churchill. Of course, I always love to mention Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes, Robert the Bruce, Matthias Baldwin, who was an abolitionist, even guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan. I got the long list, and I'll spare you the rest just to show you how silly some of this is. But one of the interesting arguments that's coming out is that everybody wants to focus on symbols rather than on substance. And Jim Garrity talked about the fact that even today, New York Times, somebody was simply saying, you know, we just have to take down all of the statues of George Washington, even rename the Washington Monument because of the evils that they have done. And that maybe museums could provide some of that context, but there is really no reason we should have any public monument in any public space of anybody who we determine is not fit for that area to be displayed. And of course, it illustrates again how we, in many cases, want to prefer some of these, as he says, symbolic gestures rather than actual problem solving. Because if you remember what kind of started this, wasn't it about trying to make sure that African Americans were not brutalized under the law enforcement, and that we maybe think about ways to rein in the police? And then we had a Justice Act that was not even being allowed to be considered because Democrats prevented even an open debate on it. And so after a while, you get these situations that, as he gives us a short list, for example, the Golden Girls. There's one episode where they're wearing mud masks, but because that was maybe perceived as blackface, they've removed that episode from Hulu. Of course, you have the makers of Dungeons and Dragons that are removing the concept of evil races like orcs or dark elves from the game. Did not know that one until I read this one today. Of course, we're getting new names for like Eskimo pies. You know, I mentioned the one yesterday, Dixie Chicks, things like that. Vogue is trying to figure out how to provide opportunities for black editors, writers, and photographers, which I think is a positive. You have Mercedes announced an all-black car for the 2020 Formula One season as a pledge to improve diversity of our team and our sport. So that you are aware of this, Mercedes right now and the company's Formula One workforce consist of all of 3% minorities. Okay. They got some work to do for sure on that. The CEO of Warner Media, for example, declared that racism is a problem and that they have been really working on this at Warner Media for many years. But if anything, the evidence is that Warner Media is becoming less diverse the higher you go up on the corporate ladder. Bill Gates just the other day said, I'm committed to listening and learning more about systemic racism and what I can do with my actions and words to help create a more equal and just future. As a matter of fact, he was, as you may remember, the richest man in the world from 1995 to 2017. And in case you're wondering, Microsoft's worldwide staff is 4% black. Oh, okay. I think you can see the idea. Let me give you one more, since I got a producer that does acting. You know, Marvel Studios, I love this. We stand against racism. We stand for inclusion. And so then you look at various actors, Anthony Mackie, for example, and some of the others. He says, I've done 7 Marvel movies where every producer, every director, every stunt person, every costume designer, every PA, every single person has been white. We've had one black producer, who is, of course, Nate Moore, who produced Black Panther. And then when you had Black Panther, you at least had a black director, black producer, black costume designer. But other than that, you've got a lot of people that talk a big game. And what I'm saying is lead by example. That makes sense. You know, if indeed you really want to be inclusive, show us that you're really trying. And anyway, there's just a lot more of examples. I've run out of time before we run out of content, but I just thought I'd put that on the table and get you thinking about it as well. And most importantly, we are coming to the end of our fiscal year today. Matter of fact, my little countdown clock says we got 11 hours, 31 minutes. So if you've been waiting to the last day, and I do know that there are a few people that listen to Point of View that tend to wait to the last hour, the last day, well, we're here. So if you have been thinking about maybe this would be a good organization to support, we certainly do ask for your financial support. We've got a match on the table, which means your gift of $50 becomes $100. Your gift of $200 becomes $400. Whatever you might want to do will be matched, and we certainly are hopeful that we will be able to meet our match because that would be just incredibly helpful to us at Point of View. So you can find that information at the website, pointofview.net. You can click on the button there that says Give Now. We talk about the fact that we live in a time of uncertainty, and at times like these, people looking for answers. And I'm hoping just in the last couple of minutes, I've shared a few things you probably have heard nowhere else. And we are dedicated to educating you and giving you a chance, as we'll talk about in just a minute, to hear from Bill Dotson, Chuck Bentley, Louie Gohmert. And so if you value the news, information, commentary we give to you, I hope that you'll consider going to the website, pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. If you'd like to talk to somebody, the pledge line number is 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, 2 of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you've ever listened to Point of View, you know that many times we've talked about the importance of fathers. Even yesterday, we had Colonel Alan West on. He was talking about one of the biggest challenges in one of the reasons for so many problems in the African-American community is absent fathers. And, of course, even fathers that are maybe there physically may not be there emotionally or spiritually. So any ministry that can be used to encourage fathers, I think, is a very worthwhile organization. And that's why we wanted to talk about, for a few minutes, Abiding Fathers Ministry. Bill Dotson is the one that actually put this together. He spent 50 years in the real estate industry, but a number of years ago, really decades ago, if we want to be honest, really God called him to start Dallas Real Estate Ministries, and he's the founder emeritus. He's also spent almost a half a century teaching in prisons and juvenile detention centers and men's homeless centers and things of that nature. But he's also the founder and president of an organization we're going to talk about right now, which we have on our website, Abiding Fathers. You can simply go to abidingfathers.org, or, of course, you will find the information on the website. So, Bill, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
Talk about how this all got started. I mean, in some respects, I gave a little of your history, but in some respects, people might say, you know, you could just be retired, you could be enjoying life, and instead you're involved in a kind of a full-time ministry, actually been involved in different ministries for years. So talk a little bit about how this all came together.
Well, the quick story would be that I had a spiritual awakening around 32 years of age, and the Word of God just started leaping off the page, and I was reading one day where he said, you visited me in prison, and you did it the least of these, you did it unto me. And I said, Lord, I guess I could go to prison. I can teach. I teach couples at the church. And lo and behold, about a week later, a couple came up to me and said, Bill, we need a teacher out of Seagoville. We worship, but we don't have a teacher. Would you consider it? And I said, well, I'm in. And that started the journey, and all the things you've talked about, the teaching scriptures and encountering men, really is the impetus of this ministry. God burdened my heart for what's burdening his heart, and being with these men weekly and these boys in the juvenile detention center and the homeless shelters, virtually every one of them are there because of the absentee father. You spoke of Alan West. He was our first speaker 2 years ago and brought a strong message. And we believe, I personally believe, because of what I've seen in the prisons and all of the encounters, even in my own life, and friends and people we've taught and equipped, it's really the number one issue in America today is the absentee father.
I know,
like
and it's something that sometimes is quite frankly ignored. I mean, we have talked about it, and there have been books and other articles written about it. We've done programs on Fatherless America and on, but first of all, I would encourage our listeners to go to abidingfathers.org. There's a good kind of 6-minute video that shows you going into prisons and kind of gives a little bit of the background on Abiding Fathers. Then there's all sorts of examples, you know, Father's Legacy, Capturing the Heart of a Child, Fathering 101 intro, and much more. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about this, but maybe I need to start watching some videos, there are quite a number that you have there. And so let's talk about what you are doing, because we would like to have as much of a ministry as we can to those who unfortunately grew up in dysfunctional homes. But I know that you're certainly trying to solve the problem at all sorts of different venues and in different stages of life. So talk about the kind of the extent of what happens at Abiding Fathers.
Well, we essentially have 4 pillars in our ministry that God has ordained. The first one is to go into the marketplace, the churches, schools, wherever dads are, and try to encourage them, equip them, engage them, to help them to be the dad God wants them to be. and to help them to understand the role so they can fulfill their role. And as Jesus said in his last words to the disciples, go as you're going, make disciples. Well, God has laid children right in a man's lap in his own home, if he's there, to disciple. And not just to raise the children, but to disciple them for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we also have the prison ministry, which grew out of the burden. And there's a tremendous need there. We're in 16 prisons. We need people, volunteers, to be able to teach, equip men in various prisons. The state of Texas has approved our curriculum. And we've just gotten approved for Oklahoma. Once everything opens back up, we hope to be able to be invited into different prisons. So prisons, marketplace, churches. We also have Fathers Forums, which are live meetings, breakfasts, lunches, various places in Dallas. We have 2 going right now. We're on Zoom right now because of the meeting issues. But beyond that, we also have what we classify as BeTheDadMovement.com, and that's to try to go online to reach the dads, especially this new generation of fathers who get most of their information through technology and whatever. And we are doing our best to develop a means and a way to contact them, to penetrate their lives, to teach them, equip them, and to actually engage them in trying to be that dad that God wants them to be.
And again, I'm sure that whenever somebody says, tell me about all the things happening in Abiding Dad, the first thing they hear is, because you have so much. And let me break those down a little bit. If you go to the website, abidingfathers.org, and you want to talk about Be the Dad on Purpose, and you want to know about, we're going to talk about emails and videos and all the rest. But let's start with the easy one, because some people might say, okay, I may not necessarily be ready to go into a prison yet, although that's certainly a great opportunity, or maybe go into a homeless shelter or something like that. But I'm a dad, or my husband is a dad, or I'm the child and I want to give this to my dad. Talk about what Fathering 101 looks like at Abiding Fathers.
Well, it's basically a 12-week curriculum. We can do it weekly, over weekends, whatever, but it's essentially the elements of discipleship: love, pray, model, etc. And what we do is equip the dads, say at a church. This is used as an example. At your church, you could be the concerned father or pastor or mother that wants the men in their church to be equipped as dads. Then we would come in and equip those volunteers, those teachers, and they in turn would be equipped to teach their dads that are in their church or wherever, school, social media, wherever they are encountering dads. But a church is an excellent place. We could train 2 or 3 men in each church, and then they could take it from there and equip their dads. The next generation of fathers is what our biggest concern is to be able to teach them biblically how to be the dad that God wants them to be.
Sure. Let's talk about that. That's a big issue. We do, and Bill, you may know, but if not, we do a millennial roundtable here, which is really convened primarily by people that are either millennials or Generation Z, which would be the iGen generation. And if there's one thing we've recognized, a good number of them have not grown up in homes with a dad. So then when they find themselves being in a position to be a father, they don't have very good information, and they don't have any great role models. And so in some respects, that's why this movement that you've created, Be the Dad, has become so important, right?
I agree wholeheartedly. And one of the things we have learned, and we have a survey. I developed a survey probably right at the beginning when I wrote the book, From Faith to Faith. The survey is to have the men examine their father, because you cannot move forward and be the dad that you need to be if you're still broken as a son. So most of these men, most of us, have come from a less than desirable or less than perfect home situation with a dad and absent dad. Maybe it's even a good dad who raised you, but you didn't disciple you, and you don't have that role model. And so we try to initially address the hurts and the pains, and we ask these men to go, even if their dad's dead, go to the graveside if you know where he's buried, and ask his forgiveness and thank him. And if you can just thank him for one thing, for giving you life. If he was the person that gave you life.
Perfect.
And,
let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about some other things we can do in Be the Dad right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Bill Dotson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about Abiding Fathers Ministry. AbidingFathers.org is the website. Of course, we have a link there as well, also to his Twitter page and Facebook page, so you'll find some great material there. But in some respects, when you were talking about going to the father's grave or going to your father and ask forgiveness or forgiving or whatever it might be, it, I think, illustrates another point, and that is for many people that have grown up in this generation, their father was absent. In other cases, they maybe had a father, but there is a father wound that needs to be healed. And again, as an individual that's gone into prisons, juvenile detention centers, men's homeless shelters, you've seen that first really up front and personal, haven't you?
Yes. that you sort of took the words out of my mouth. The father wound is prevalent in. I read an article about 2 years ago that said 90% of every person, man, woman, and child in America has some level of a father wound. Yes, some of them have a mother's wound, but mostly it's the father wound that has to be healed. And to move on well, you can move on, but to move on well and be something that God's called you to be, whatever it might be, you've got to deal with those issues because I will use the term Satan. He will use it as a leverage in your life continually until you've addressed it. I see it in my own life, things that I need to address, and I see it in others. But really, when men have not had that father, that wound is so deep, and some require major operations. Some might be a Band-Aid, but it's a major, major issue. I might add that our ministry also has flourished, and a year ago we started Padre de Corazon, and that is to the Hispanic community. And we have found an incredible reception across this country, across our neighborhoods, and in the churches, even in Cuba and different parts of the Latin America. And we've also, my daughter and a board member, Robin Bush, started a support ministry inside Abiding Fathers, which is Women's Heart Initiative, to be a support element for the wives to support their husbands and the dads in their life to be effective in their discipleship.
Let's talk about that for just a minute, because some of our listeners might say, well, I'll have to visit the website and see if there's some material I can put together. But you really have kind of a plug-and-play opportunity. First of all, for individuals that are teachers, you have a number of the study guides and the training manuals and a number of DVDs, as well as your book, Faith to Faith. And so that's available both in English and in Spanish. And then you have what's called a participant pack, which is just the two books, the study guide and your From Faith to Faith. And there are 10 different sessions. So if somebody says, we really need to disciple fathers, and I want to do it inside the church, I want to do it in my small group, I want to do it in my Bible fellowship, you really have everything they need to just get started instantaneously, don't you?
Yes, actually, it's so well put together. God did a good job. They can take it and take our colleague training manual, all the participant manuals, the books, their Bible, and they can start on their own. But we offer the opportunity to train and equip them, maybe a 4 or 5 hour session, just to help them to understand what is trying to be taught and learned out of each one of the sessions. So, yes, you're exactly right.
And again, if I count them right, you've got an introduction with Greg Vaughn, who, by the way, is a good friend, has been on this program many times as well, and you. And then you have the 10 sessions and a conclusion. So it's kind of like 12 weeks, and that's kind of fits into a quarter. And so you would probably, I gather, recommend that you do one a week. But talk about how to actually implement this.
Yeah, one a week. We find that probably 8 to 12 men at a time really works well. That way they can be intimate. They can share what's said in this room sort of stays in this room, helping one another, iron sharpening iron. But larger groups, yes, that can work if you break them down into maybe a core leader for each group of 8 or 10 men. If you had, say, 100 guys in your church, you could break that down and have core leaders for each 8 to 10, 12. But it is a 12-week session, and normally, and you're exactly right. You laid it out, and the elements of that you've spoken of that God laid on my heart when He wrote the book was love, to pray, to model, to mentor, to listen, to teach, to discipline, to bless, to provide, and to protect. That's what we address, because it's more than just providing and protecting. Most men have seen their father be a hard worker, and he's put a roof over your head, and he put food on your table and give you an education. But he sort of left everything else to the mother, grandmother, teacher, pastor, Sunday school teacher, whatever. And it best comes from the dad in the home. That's where it's the strongest.
So again, this is all at abidingfathers.org. You can go to the store to find some of the things we've been talking about here, but there are all sorts of videos that maybe you can use to get started here, learning about the whole organization. There's a way in which you can sign up just to get some interesting emails into your inbox. And of course, to really reach the next generation, we've talked about to be the dad on purpose. And so all of that is available at the website. And I think, if nothing else, this is a great opportunity for us to address what is, I think, a crucial issue in our culture today, the absence of fathers and the need for father love and to deal with father wound and all the other things that we've talked about. So, Bill, I appreciate the fact that you've been willing to kind of step out on this issue and to develop so many great resources. They're really plug and play. If you wanted to start tomorrow, everything you need is there, but you also will provide training. So all that you have to do is find your way to abidingfathers.org, and you've got it. So thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been a blessing. Thank you for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of issues. I'll do a brief announcement about the Supreme Court decision. But then, one of the articles I've posted here, woke culture comes from college, and it really has to do with this technical term, deconstruction. Why is it so many college students today are just convinced that America is just rife with intolerance and racism and misogyny and repression and those kinds of things? Well, Elizabeth Powers reminds us that a lot of that simply is what is taught, for example, in the English classes, and what used to not be taught in classes like on Western civilization, which no longer are required on most universities. So instead of teaching love for country and maybe even learning some lessons from some very dark chapters in American history, we have professors that have been running down this university campus and running down the university curriculum and running down the country and all of that, and done it in a way that has made just a whole generation of angry young people that want to tear down monuments. So we'll get into that as well. Also, some other issues of people even trying to abolish Amazon. Boy, it just gets worse every day. So we have a lot to cover, but before we take a break, let's mention again, we are at the end of our fiscal year. That's June 30th. That's today. And we have a matching fund on the table. And if you would like to support us, and I hope that you would, then let me encourage you to make your special and very significant gift. You can go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on the button there that says Give Now. And if you'd like to give us a call, the pledge line number, 800-347-5151. We'll come back, and Chuck Bentley will be with us a little bit later. All that coming up right after this.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter, and that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening, and today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, two of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today for the Tuesday edition of Point of View. And it is our last day of our fiscal year. And of course, as you have perhaps been hearing us talk about, this is a very significant time for us because we oftentimes want to end the fiscal year in the black. And I hope that we will be able to do so. And we had something happen just over the last couple of days that kind of never happened before. And that is we had some people step forward with a matching fund. One was announced on Thursday. The other came after the show on Friday. So here we are, in a sense, putting together a matching fund of $100,000. And so if you have not already participated, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to mention that as we are getting into the program today. Chuck Bentley will be with us in about a half an hour. He is, of course, CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. We're going to talk about stewardship. One of the articles I've posted by him, preparing for another pandemic. And so preparation and dealing with even the current one will be some of the topics we will address. We will, the next hour, spend just a little bit of time talking with Representative Louie Gohmert. He has some comments to say about the pandemic, of the coronavirus, some of the issues of immigration, deportation, some of the Supreme Court decisions. And speaking of Supreme Court decision, we have a victory for religious liberty today. And I thought I might spend just a minute talking about that. And then we're going to get into a couple of the articles. One that I've posted called Woke Culture Comes from College. Another one, can't make this up. Abolish Amazon. Yeah, that's where we knew it's going to move for more than just abolishing the police. So we'll talk about some of that in just a minute. But let's talk about a victory today. The Supreme Court ruled that indeed states that are offering scholarships for students in private schools cannot exclude religious schools from those same programs. Now, the decision was actually rendered by 5 of the Supreme Court justices and written by the Chief Justice John Roberts. Even though we've been critical of him in some of the other decisions, this one was a good one. And again, the court really didn't say that states should provide religious education, but simply said that if they do, they cannot distinguish nor differentiate between religious and secular schools. Chief Justice John Roberts put it this way: a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they're religious. Now, as you might imagine, some of the leaders of the teachers' unions completely mischaracterized this, and I did love one of the dissents that came from the Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, well, petitioners may still send their kids to a religious school, but they just simply can't have scholarships. Well, thank you so very much. This arose out of a case in Montana, and I wrote about this back a number of months ago simply because I sensed that this would be a significant decision. And so if you want to go back to my commentary on February 3rd, you'll notice that it is actually titled End of Blame. Now, that, I think, illustrates another reason why so often I encourage you to listen to Point of View. On USA Today, I'm reading, and finally, by the 10th paragraph, there is at least a quote from Chief Justice Roberts about the Blaine Amendment, which he said was born of bigotry and arose at a time of pervasive hostility to the Catholic Church and to Catholics in general. Now, if you've not listened to Point of View, you probably never heard anybody talk about the Blaine Amendment. If you read lots of articles about this today or watch any kind of announcement on television, you won't hear anything about it. So let me try to educate you briefly, and it, I think, illustrates again why I hope you listen to Point of View and why I hope you support Point of View, because the Blaine Amendment was a failed attempt to amend the U.S. Constitution so that government aid could not be provided essentially to the Catholic schools. It was rooted in kind of an anti-Catholic bias. There was a concern that maybe there would be money that would go from federal coffers or state coffers to these various Catholic parochial schools. So it was a deliberate attempt to prevent any money going to Catholic schools. And so that's what was proposed. It didn't make it into the U.S. Constitution. It did, in different ways, make it into about 3/4 of the state constitutions. Many of them have been removed. But now we come to the story of Kendra Espinoza, as well as a couple of other mothers, who wanted to enroll their children in a non-denominational Christian school. And Montana's Constitution says, no, you can't have any public funds going for sectarian purposes. Well, back in the 19th century, sectarian meant Catholic schools. They just simply used it now to say, well, that applies to any Christian school. And so the argument is pretty simple. The Supreme Court's already ruled in another case called Trinity Lutheran, and that was a situation in which you, in Missouri, had a Christian school that applied for a federal grant to actually have playground resurfacing. They take all these old tires and chew them up, and it's great to protect the kids. And the argument at the time was, well, no, we can't provide you with any playground resurfacing because you're a Christian school. But kids in a Christian school or a secular school, public school, whatever, they all need those kinds of resources so that they don't get hurt. Wish I had them when I was growing up, for sure. And so the Supreme Court ruled in that favor. And again, now the Supreme Court has ruled that simply because you have a scholarship program, and it's a really very insignificant one. I think one of them, the scholarships, was all of $500. But nevertheless, it was more the principle of the thing. It now has ruled that just because you have a Christian school, you can't apply different rules to a Christian school than you apply to other private schools. Kelly Shackelford today said, again, the Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution prevents the government from treating religious organizations and schools unequally. The justices made it clear that states cannot legally discriminate against religious organizations when they perform the same work secular institutions do. This is a victory for religious liberty. I would completely agree. And let me also mention that John Hartley said, interestingly enough, this decision that came down today, he argued, is unquestionably a win for the school choice movement. He also says it just turns out today that the Hoover Institution's Thomas Sowell, who is a very prominent economist, African-American, has a book on school choice that comes out today. So in some respects, maybe this will help the idea of school choice. I think his book is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. It's also Thomas Sowell's 90th birthday. The man is very lucid for the age of 90, but it illustrates again that this was a very important case in terms of religious liberty. And if you'd like to know more about the background to it, my February 3rd Viewpoints commentary talks about the Blaine Amendment. But as I pointed out just a minute ago, I've got some articles here from the Associated Press, a variety of other places. Only do I find in USA Today at the moment, and you have to go down to the 10th paragraph, does it even mention the Blaine Amendment? And, of course, if you don't know anything about it, you're just going to go, well, whatever that means. And I think it just, again, illustrates that we are not well served sometimes by those individuals that are reporting the news. And if you today hear all sorts of people say this is an unconstitutional establishment of religion, it's simply saying that you treat everything equally. The example I love to use sometimes is after World War II, some of our fathers or grandfathers came home from the war. They got the GI Bill. They were allowed to use it at Vanderbilt or SMU or Notre Dame or the University of Texas, the University of Georgia or Princeton or Yale, University of California at Berkeley, Fresno State. It didn't make any difference. And so that principle there should apply to this principle here today. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, the president of iVoter Guide explained on my radio program how COVID shows how elections matter. Debbie Withnow said that COVID reminds us that elected officials can make life and death decisions. Now, it may be tempting to think that elections are just politics. We learn from various orders and pronouncements, however, by elected officials that they have significant power over our lives. She also argued that COVID revealed how vulnerable our religious liberties are. Some elected officials singled out church services for special sanctions. Legal organizations were busy trying to defend churches. Also related was the reality that COVID revealed how vulnerable our civil liberties are. A lone surfer was fined. Police ticketed 22 people in cars watching the sunset. A man was arrested for playing t-ball with his 6-year-old daughter in a park. On the other hand, she noted COVID also showed us that many officials still support religious and civil liberties. Many elected officials pushed back against the irresponsible edicts. Judges even struck down some of the most blatant acts of bullying. Unfortunately, politicians use the pandemic crisis to stuff special interest pork into laws meant to help average Americans. These bills were also used to funnel money to wealthy universities and the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. COVID also showed that politicians' worldview matters. We all agree that saving the lives of the elderly and at-risk people is something the government should do, but that same concern for life did not extend to the unborn. Abortion clinics were kept open because they were considered essential services. The pandemic was a reminder of how important the November elections will be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit of time, if we can, talking about some of the various ideas that surface on a college campus. My first article is entitled, Woke Culture Comes from College. The actual title is Deconstruction Goes Mainstream, but that might not make so much sense. And, of course, there is the old famous phrase that has been attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Doubtful maybe he ever said it, but he at least has been attributed to him that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next. And we certainly can see that there is a great deal of campus unrest, and that campus unrest has now gone into society. Matter of fact, I'm holding up my booklet that I did a number of months ago, which is entitled A Biblical View on Campus Unrest. And most of the book has to do with a very insightful book that came out called The Coddling of the American Mind. And one of the authors, Greg Lukianoff, is a Christian. The other author, interesting enough, Jonathan Haidt is not, but they teamed up, and we did have Jonathan Haidt on the program to talk about this. And on that, we really spent some time talking about some of the reasons why you have such conflict on the campus. And now we've seen how it's spilled out onto the society. So I wanted to post this article because even though it might be seen as just a little bit intellectual, it maybe gives another explanation for why we're seeing so much anger out there on the streets. And it starts out by Elizabeth Powers saying that a recent Wall Street Journal editorial talked about dogmas that begun on the university. And she says, these dogmas go by various names: postmodernism, which we've talked about on this program, multiculturalism. But she says, I'm going to gather all these under the term deconstruction. Now, if you're not familiar with deconstruction, even the people that buy into it probably don't even know of its origins. And it was fun to, by the time I turned to the second page, actually point out that 18-year-olds probably don't even know who Jacques Derrida is and where this came from the French. But the concept is simply this. When you read these various pieces of literature, your goal is to deconstruct them. And what you do is you're trying to expose the subversive and the submerged ideology of power, racism, misogyny, repression, whatever it might be in one of those novels. And so if you're reading English literature, you're exposed to that. Of course, if you then, as a student, go to a history department, there are some historians and are some great history professors that talk about some of the greatness of American exceptionalism, but most of them simply talk about it in a negative sense. Some of the most significant books that have come out and textbooks that have come out in the 20th century look at history from a Marxist point of view, for example, look at it from an economic point of view, and look at it from an assumption that anybody who is a white male, by definition, deserves criticism. And certainly if that white male had slaves, well, that's a deal breaker right there. And so as she points out, when professors stopped talking about Milton's prose and started pointing out his treatment of the daughters, when they stopped talking about the brilliance of Shakespeare and began to say that we really need to read some of these very obscure authors because they came with certain racist ideas and helped us expose some of this, all the rest. And then when we had requirements that no longer said you should take a class in Western civilization, you probably wouldn't understand that. And when you think in many cases that these are individuals that probably aren't worth studying in the first place, then you basically end up with a philosophy of deconstruction that essentially justifies being angry at the culture, angry at anybody that you might perceive as being intolerant, racist, privileged, or a misogynist. And so we are now, in a sense, seeing some of the reality of how that came about. For those of you that have been listening to Point of View for a long time, you know that even back in the 1980s and 90s, Marlon Maddox and I and Penna Dexter and others would be talking about some of these ideas being expressed on the college campuses. And here, I think, if nothing else, Elizabeth Powers helps us understand that we move from a time in which we had certain requirements, and she talks about those, many of which had nothing to do with your major. We didn't expect that you were only going to take classes in engineering or only classes in biology or only classes in physics or only classes in business. You'd have to take some other kind of rounding classes. But when more and more of those classes were taken over by individuals that in one way or another wanted to present their biased view and their view of how awful this country is, we are then seeing the results in terms of this campus unrest. And that campus unrest now has made its way out into the society. But there was one other point that she made here, which I thought was fascinating because it relates to the second article that we have here as well. This deconstruction theory was the idea that you read forward. In other words, you don't read in the past and you don't read even in the present. A lot of postmodernism simply says, you just read into it what you want to read into it. But this idea of reading forward makes some sense because now we're starting to see people, and this relates to the second article, to abolish the present. You go, what in the world does that mean? Let's start with a simple one. You had activists outside of the home of the CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and they were demanding that Amazon be abolished. Not likely, but nevertheless the case. One of the protesters was heard over the bullhorn. When they become threatened, we have no voice and the knives come out. Which is pretty scary to have somebody saying that outside your home, because while he's saying that over a bullhorn, they've also constructed a guillotine, which I thought was very appropriate because what's happening right now looks exactly like the French Revolution. So you might say, who is they? Who is we? What about the knives coming out and everything? But the concept is they want to get rid of not just the police, They just not only want to abolish the police, they want to abolish the prisons, they want to abolish Amazon. And the group that actually has put this together is a group called Abolish the Present, Reconstruct Our Future. And so in some respects, you could rereading these two different articles, and if you didn't see the connection, you realize that we are convinced that the past is just full of white males that we don't need to hear from. Some of them were slave owners, but it really doesn't make any difference. You've heard me rattle off this long, long list of individuals that have actually been removed. It's not just Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but it's U.S. Grant, it's Winston Churchill, it's Gandhi, it's Cervantes, it's even the abolitionist Matthias Baldwin, and hey, even the guitarist Stephen Ray Vaughan. You know how that all fits together? Because all of that is the past, and really we want to even abolish the present. And we want to have this new utopian future. And so if you've been trying to figure out why is all of this happening on campus, these two articles I think would be very interesting. And it's an illustration again why many years ago when Marlon Maddox was doing this program, we talked about what was being taught on the college campuses, and those ideas in the campus have made their way into society. But I thought just before we take a break here, I wanted to bring the president of Point of View, Warren Kelly, in to give us a little bit of an update. We mentioned some of this yesterday, and what I thought was really so helpful is a lot of you said, you know, when I was listening on Friday, you had a $50,000 match. All of a sudden, Monday, you got $100,000. And since people don't always have a chance to listen every day, Warren, maybe you can explain how we went from 2 or 3 days before that, not having anything, to now having a pretty significant match fund.
It was last Thursday. Foster Freeze was on with you, and he surprised us all with a match that he threw out on the table for $50,000. And so we were very excited by that. And then at just the end of the day on Friday, we had another donor that stepped up and said that she would like to give as well. And so that made another $50,000. So that's really awesome that we have that out there. But both of these donors are people that don't give unless we raise the money to match it. And so we have 2 days, or had 2 days. We're down to our last day now. Our fiscal year ends tonight. And so we really need to hear from you. We are doing good, and we're so thankful for those of you who have given. We're up to about $41,000 so far.
That's good.
So we're almost halfway there, but we're over halfway through the 2 days that we had to do this in. So we really need to hear from you today, if at all possible.
Again, I just wanted to get an update here. Maybe we'll do one before the end of the show, but I just thought real quickly, when I look down, and if you go to pointofview.net, you will see that the clock is counting down 10 hours, 31 minutes. And I feel the clock counting. Matter of fact, every time I look down there. And so if you've been saying, hey, I really appreciate this, you're talking about things that I appreciate the kind of guests. We're going to have Chuck Bentley with us. We're going to have Representative Louie Gohmert next hour. Then I just encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Give Now. Or, again, I know some of people off air are taking some phone calls. So the pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. And if it gets really busy, you'll get Warren Kelly answering the phone, right?
Right.
So thanks for the update. We'll do again maybe an hour from now, because I know people want to know, how's it coming? So let's take a break, and then we'll spend some time with Chuck Bentley right after this.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, 2 of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to have Chuck Bentley with us, but one question was asked off air. I think we gave the answer, and we've talked about this before. In order to meet the match, and again, the people that we're dealing with are supporters of Point of View, so they're very gracious. If your check has the date today, June 30th, or they have a postmark, that's probably enough. For those of you that like to do it old school, and my wife and I were old school, we write out a check and put it in the mail. But again, if you would like to talk to someone, the pledge line number is 800-347-5151. I'll give the on-air number in just a minute, but I don't want to confuse everybody. And, of course, you can go to pointofview.net, and you will find all the information there. One of the individuals we love to bring on the program because we learn so much about the economic issues, and I've posted one of his kind of Ask Chuck questions, preparing for another pandemic, is Chuck Bentley. He is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. You hear him as the host of the daily radio program by Money Life. He's also the founder and executive director of the Christian Economic Forum. He's a graduate of Baylor University. He and his family live in Knoxville, Tennessee. And Chuck, it is just always so much fun to have you on with us on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's always my pleasure. I've been listening to the program all day today, so I feel like we need to continue the conversation of the last place you left us was on that deconstructionism.
Deconstruction,
and it was,
yeah.
To me, Kerby, it's the very essence of why Point of View is so important. There is a movement for deconstruction to happen in this country. It's infiltrated our education systems. It's happening all around us, and we're looking at it come to life right before our very eyes. And to me, for those who love what you do, there's never been a more important time to recognize that those views have to be combated with truth, and you do it in such a skillful, loving, compassionate way. I am just excited to be able to help advance the cause today, Kerby.
You know, again, some people might say, I learned so much on Point of View. You just a while ago talked about the Blaine Amendment, and I doubt anybody's going to hear about how that was set aside now with that Supreme Court decision. They're just going to hear people screaming that church and state are being mixed together, which is not being true at all. And then we're just talking about deconstruction, or I doubt 1 in 1,000 people even know who Jacques Derrida is. Even these kids out there quoting some of these ideas don't know where those come from. So we're trying to educate you, but also prepare you, because if nothing else, Chuck, we've got turmoil in the streets. And if there's ever been a time for people to say, which side I'm going to pick, the mob and anarchy or the rule of law and some level of law and order, that's becoming kind of the big choice before us right now here in the 21st century.
I don't think it's ever been more clear. It's presented daily in the news what's happening. These ideas have become reality. People are acting upon what they sincerely believe, what they've sincerely been taught and believed to be the right way. They believe in utopianism, and that's why they're tearing down all the examples of those who were flawed or sinned or had some sort of character issue in their life. They want to get rid of all those examples as if they could usher in utopianism. And I remember back in the days of Marlon Maddox, and it even goes back to Francis Schaeffer when he would say,
yes,
those who demand utopianism, they're expecting perfection or nothing, and they're going to end up with nothing. Ultimately, it's a self-destructive philosophy. It destroys all that is good in its wake. It's like a fire that if it's used well, it could cleanse, but if it's used poorly and without law, without guidance, without boundaries, it destroys everything. And as I look at the scripture, Kerby, lawlessness is described in 2 Thessalonians as the work of the devil. Lawlessness is when the devil says what God said is good, which are boundaries for all of us to bring order and structure. Our God is a God of order. When those are done away with, then we have the work of the enemy. These are spiritual battles that we're seeing happen before our very eyes. And lawlessness means that truth becomes a lie and lie becomes a truth. And how many times a day, Kerby, are we logging in and saying, wait a minute, that's true, and somebody else is now saying it's a lie, or I know that's a lie according to God's word, and they're declaring it to be truth. That's a very dangerous time for any society. You've described it as sort of the rumblings of the French Revolution. I think there's a Marxist revolution underneath it. There's a whole lot of misguided teaching on, that Marxism was some sort of, compassionate idea to help the middle class or the poor, that it was the Robin Hood plan to take from the rich and redistribute wealth. And, of course, you and I both know that anybody who believes that would be naive and horribly mistaken. I've traveled to those areas where those ideas have been implemented, and the repercussions are horrific. People don't like to hear this, and it's politically incorrect to say it, but atheism has been responsible for more deaths in the world than all the religions combined. When there's a godlessness, when there's a vacuum in society, and there are no rules, or there's the desire that we can live however we want to live, that's when death and destruction are most rampant. And we do have to have people like yourselves who are skillfully educating us on the value of God's Word, the value of a biblical worldview. The hashtag that I keep thinking of, Kerby, and I'm sorry I'm going off on my topic here a little bit, but I keep thinking of the hashtag, truth matters, our beliefs matter, worldview matters, and we really do need to have our minds renewed by the work that you're doing so that we understand what really is truth, because there's a great attempt to try to confuse what is truth right now.
You were talking about the idea that Marxist ideas or other even big government ideas haven't worked in other countries. I mentioned that it's Thomas Sowell's birthday today, and one of the phrases I've used before is Thomas Sowell, who's at the Hoover Institute, said, "I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty." He, of course, is African American himself and looking at that. And so we know what works, because what works actually is thrift, investment, good stewardship, which is one of the reasons I posted your article. And just before we get into the article, let me just mention also, I just had somebody come in here and say, well, that's what Chuck Bentley does. Almost all the pledge line numbers are full right now. So if you call and you get a busy signal, just keep trying. So that's what you do, Chuck. All of a sudden the phones ring when you come on the air. But what about this? Because this one was talking about preparing for another pandemic. In some respects, the principle there is a biblical principle. That is, to recognize that the unexpected always happens. We are in a fallen world, and I think we always assume that tomorrow is just going to be as good as today, or tomorrow is even going to be better than it is today, and sometimes that just simply doesn't happen.
Well, it's always good to have a level of optimism, but I think realism is a better worldview than optimism. In fact, realism says things are tough, things are difficult, things are bad, there is sin in the world, that's reality, but there's hope in the midst of reality. And I think that's what the Bible offers us. And when we look at what we're going through, I think this pandemic is just a warm-up act.
Yes.
I think we're going to see more and more challenges and waves of challenges. Right now we have layered levels of complexity, layered levels of crises, one on top of the other. And I think it's screaming to God's people, be prepared for the future, be prepared for more to come. The Bible tells us that no man knows the future, that we're always to live as those who are prepared for the purpose, not just self-preservation. And that's where the Bible deviates from the people, who are just hoarding and preparing to survive. The Bible tells us to be prepared to serve when others are hurting. And I think that's where we distinguish ourselves in the culture. We bring God's beauty and God's compassion and God's kindness into the crisis. We're the Florence Nightingales of the world who go into the battlefields to bring the healing balm. We're the Desmond Dosses of the world who go where the fire is great and where the war is raging, and we bring peace and we bring compassion and truth, and we bring the type of truth that helps bring healing to the world. And that's why we need to be prepared. I really think, Kerby, that being financially prepared puts us in a position to do more good in a crisis than any other time. That's when we set ourselves apart from those who weren't prepared. They've been foolish. They got caught off guard. They got surprised. And suddenly there we are, the church, the body of Christ, who've been wise, who've been sacrificial, and now we're ready to help others.
What a great vision. Let's take a break, and we are talking today with Chuck Bentley, and he's got some great material in this one about spending wisely, set aside emergency funds, and even the various apps or envelope systems. And as we go to a break, I hope that you will also consider your gift to Crown Financial, because we think so very highly of them. And, of course, we have a link to his website. We have one of these articles, which you can find in his blog on a regular basis, because he's so good at answering these questions. But we'll take a break. And as we do so, you might want to go to the website, pointofview.net. I know it won't be quite as busy there as it apparently has been on the phones, and that is pointofview.net, but you can also give it a try at the pledge line, 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Great for a few more minutes with Chuck Bentley. And again, he is the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries, also the founder and executive director of Christian Economic Forum. And just to give you, if you will, a program note, next hour we're going to talk a little bit about this very good piece by Michael Brendan Doherty, Fallen Statues, Fallen Men. And there's a very incredible picture leading up to that of Michelangelo's David in Florence. And one of the lines in the thing that we will be talking about, because it reminds us that, you know, there were a lot of sinners in the Old and New Testament. But he says Michelangelo's David stands in Florence, and it isn't a tribute or an endorsement of the murder of Uriah the Hittite any more than George Washington's name on our capital city is done because he owned slaves. And so we'll get into this whole idea of the fact that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but we can still understand the value of certain individuals and leaders and people that have provided a role model. And Chuck, if nothing nothing else, you certainly have, and educated us on the fact that we may be heading through some pretty tumultuous times over the next couple of months and years. I think some people hope for just a real quick V-shaped recovery. Some of that has happened, but this virus is going to be with us for some time, and that's why I think the wise stewards of resources, including financial resources, are going to be those that God is going to use in the midst of all the uncertainty that faces our world right now.
Well, you're correct about that, Kerby. We are seeing what many really didn't expect, which is a quick recovery in the stock market. The stock markets have responded to the massive stimulus plan that the government put into place. And so with that much infusion of new money into the economic systems, the markets have responded very positively. They're also responding to the fact that they think the pandemic is going to come under control sooner than later. At the same time, and where the real disconnect is in the real economy.
Yes.
The small business owners and the people who are trying to stay afloat. And we're seeing so many really painful stories out there right now. Some of the surveys are saying that people, maybe 25 to 40% of the people say they'll never go back and work out in a gym again. And so those people who have gyms and the fitness centers of the world, they're struggling. Retail centers are struggling. Shopping malls are struggling. Investors in commercial real estate are struggling with people canceling their leases or trying to downsize right now. So we're going to see some real economic pain over the long haul. And that's why it's so important for individuals to be prepared to build their financial house on the rock, not on the shifting sand. Some of the stories in that article we posted today about being prepared for a pandemic are about people who very humbly just did the things that God said are good for us with our finances. And through all the turmoil, all the changes, all of the fear and the uncertainty and doubt, they were rewarded with diligence and faithfulness in managing their finances, and they were able to be incredibly generous. And that's what I want for the people who are passionate about what you do at Point of View, is to be really, really generous right now. I'm on a global panel, or I'm on a panel of ministry leaders who operate globally, and we've been meeting once a month since March and discussing what's happening with our organizations and what's happening with our support levels. And overall, Kerby, support has been very, very positive. I think the body of Christ realizes that this is different than an earthquake or a hurricane or a flood or a tsunami or a fire. This is actually more widespread devastation than any of those things that we've ever seen, and it's happening all over the world. And so this is the time for the body of Christ to go contrary to their fears, contrary to their own inclination to hoard resources and to give them. And we need people to give very, very generously right now to Point of View. I was reading Schaefer. That's what I've been in recently. I've been reading a lot of great works just to keep my mind renewed personally in the midst of all of this. And Schaefer said, when Jesus said, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, we're to take that literally. It is not a figure of speech. It's not just a great parable. What he's literally saying is invest in God's kingdom now so that you will have treasures waiting for you for eternity. And if we take that seriously, then we're not simply giving to a temporary cause. We're not just giving to solve a problem today. We're not just giving because there's a crisis. We're giving because our Lord, our Maker, our Creator, the Master of the universe said to us, when you give for His kingdom now, it will be rewarded to you in eternity. And so we're giving for eternal purposes. And a gift to Point of View is, by the way, I love the challenge match that you have right now, Kerby. I just loved it. It's gone from 50,000 to 100,000. And I want to see all 100,000 of that met before you close out your fiscal year. And people do that by making a gift. My wife and I give to Point of View. We support the organization. Our hearts are with you because our treasure is with you. And it's one thing to be listening and simply to cheer you on. It's another thing to say, I want to be a stakeholder in Point of View. I want to take a part of my dollars.
Guess we lost him. Well, that's okay. We'll see if there's some reason for that, but nevertheless, we'll just blank that out. And we're coming to a break anyway, so it's it's always live radio, so we'll deal with that. Let me just mention before we say goodbye to the opportunity to maybe talk to Chuck again if we catch him, but if we don't, they also have a $100,000 crisis response matching challenge, and that is at crown.org. But again, he's been calling for you to, first of all, be counterculture. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control or sound mind." So we shouldn't be fearful. We shouldn't be anxious. And again, one of my arguments, which I've made so many times, is if you are one of those individuals without a job, and I do know some individuals in my sphere of influence that have been out of a job for months, we don't even want you to feel the obligation to give to us. If nothing else, maybe you could share a prayer request with us by email, and I'll pass them on to some of the individuals here that actually pray for our various listeners. I will certainly pass it on to my daughter, who's quite the prayer warrior, and others. So those are some things we would love to do to encourage you. But perhaps some of you can step forward and help us out, because we, of course, have had some people that haven't really been able to support this ministry. So it's always sad to say goodbye to Chuck Bentley that way, but nevertheless, I'm sure you understood what he was saying. He's encouraging people to support this ministry. He and his wife Ann have supported this ministry for many years. He used to be in a Sunday school class with me. Just a great opportunity to get to know someone who would bring so much to the table. And this particular article is just one way for you to know more about what he is writing about right now, preparing for another pandemic, to expect the unexpected, to be prepared for that now, and to spend wisely, set aside emergency funds, and really, in a sense, be a shining light in the midst of darkness, and to be prepared to give. And so if you would like to help us, we certainly, as you know, have stumbled upon a $100,000 matching fund, and that's not something that usually comes together in the 2 days that it did, but we are grateful for that. And so if we can meet it, we would greatly appreciate your financial investment. A couple ways to do that. First of all, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a button there that says Give Now, and as you click through that, it talks about the uncertainty that we find ourselves in right now and some suggested donation amounts. But if that's not what you want to do and you'd rather talk to someone, let me mention again, the pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. But a lot of us just like to write out a check. That's what I do. And put it in the mail and just make sure that it's got June 30th on that, which, again, will take us a few days to add all those up before we can make our report to our two individuals that put up that matching fund. But whatever you can do, great for your helpfulness. 800-347-5151. We'll take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, two of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about a couple of the other issues we put on the table. And then Representative Louie Gohmert will be joining us in about 15 minutes. So we've got all sorts of things to talk about. Let me first again mention that we had a number of people call in. So thank you so very much for helping us get a little closer to that matching fund. And we'll see where it goes. If you were with us last hour, Chuck Bentley, all of a sudden we had some kind of glitch in the phone lines and he was going to try to come back with us, and that didn't work out. And we're just fine because we have a lot more to cover. And one of the things that he said in passing caused me to reach over and grab a piece of material here that I thought about using this hour and now am definitely going to use. It is by Michael Brendan Doherty, and I haven't posted it on the website. Maybe I can later, but it has this incredible picture of Michelangelo's David. And I've never been to Florence, Italy. If I ever go, I want to go and see this incredible sculpture. But the point that Michael Doherty is making is that you have all sorts of people that have been sort of wringing their hands about all the statues that have been brought down. And in a minute, I might even give you a further list, not just of the statues, but people feeling like they have to change their names, various stories or movies that need to be pulled, and all sorts of stuff that's just sort of out of hand. You know, can't we call them Eskimo pies? Can't we have a group called Dixie Chicks? I guess not. But it just has really begun to say that anything that would be slightly seen as tainted, to use a biblical phrase, any person that maybe has done a sinful act, that's enough to set them aside. And of course, in some cases, they want to set aside everything anyway because they want to build a new utopia. So Michael Doherty is really sort of responding to George Will. George Will is a conservative on most days, but not all. But he's also an atheist, and the point he was making is that George Will is trying to figure out and come up with some potential solutions to what he calls this hurricane of hysteria. This has just taken the nation by storm. And Michael, who I don't really know, apparently comes from a Christian point of view, because he says only a culture soaked in a belief of original sin can honor men for the good they did for the events at which they were present. And the point he's making is that if you start with the idea that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, is that a biblical phrase? Of course it is. Then we recognize that any individual, even the leaders that we emulate the most, the ones that we idolize the most, still have feet of clay. We know that, and that's understandable. And so later in his article, it goes through 2 whole pages before on the 3rd page he gets to some of the Christian content. And I might turn this into a commentary because it was very well done. He says one of the articles of faith lost was the belief in the fallen nature of man, because you have this kind of humanistic Marxist idea, whether you're an atheist, a humanist, agnostic, whether you're a Marxist or whether you're just part of the left. I mean, a lot of people have rejected that idea. And so as a result, if you believe in the fallen nature of man and human beings, then there is the ability to forgive sinners and even admire them. And he reminds us that if you go through the Old and New Testament, it's not exactly full of just great heroes you want to emulate. Maybe Joseph, maybe Daniel, you don't see too many flaws there. But let me just read his paragraphs. It gives you a pretty good idea. The biblical account stands out from a sea of paganism by exhaustively chronicling the failures of human protagonists. Jonah refused to preach God's message. King David fell into adultery and murder. The people of Israel constantly defect from a God who is faithful to them. The apostles scatter and cower after the arrest of their teacher. St. Peter denies Christ 3 times. St. Paul is present and approves of the stoning of the first Christian martyr. That's just a short list, and you know the rest of them. We can put in Samson, and we can put in all sorts of other individuals that come to mind as well. And so the point that Michael Dougherty is mentioning is all these, quote, problematic figures fill up the great frescoes of Christian churches from Moscow to Cairo to Montevideo because of the belief that providence nevertheless acts through sinful men and women. And so I think it was kind of interesting that you are reading right now this incredible radicalism that says if this person has done something which today in our 21st century world we think is wrong, that's enough to completely expunge them from history. And he says the striking thing about this moment's radicalism is that it's aimed not just at the great constitutional order, and it is, or at Christianity itself, and it is, but also at the boomer generation that played with radicalism but settled down into homes that defend with policies of real estate inflation and jobs that defend their tenure and work protections that are not afforded to the next generation. So he recognized that some of this has to do with a generational gap, which I think is something why we many times have a millennial roundtable. But his line that I quoted before is really worth mentioning because Michelangelo's David, he says, stands in Florence, Italy, and it does not stand there just as a tribute to or endorsement of the murder of Uriah the Hittite. It stands as the greatness of David with the recognition that he had his flaws as well. Now, you might say, of course, well, he was asking for forgiveness, and David was a man after God's own heart, but even he fell. And so if we can certainly look at David, then also Michael Brendan Dougherty says, just as George Washington's name graces the capital city or is in the name of various schools, we aren't doing this because he owned slaves. And my argument that I want to make is if these people are really deadly serious, let's take the most egregious example, since I went to that university, and that's Yale University. Because Yale University is named for Elihu Yale, who was not only a slave owner, but he was a slave trader. And I haven't heard one of these social justice warriors yet call for that. Another school that I went to, got a graduate degree from, is Georgetown, and I just read recently that it was the sale of more than 200 slaves that saved Georgetown University. So Georgetown University, Yale University, those are places where Bill Clinton went, also where I got 2 different master's degrees. You could make a very good case for tearing down those or changing those names, but nevertheless, this is the world that we find ourselves in today. And I think it's maybe important for us as Christians to recognize that we don't put up statues because we're convinced that people are perfect. We put up sometimes statues to remind us of those individuals that did something very heroic, something very sacrificial, but they were still flawed men and women as well. But hard to convince the mob out there right now about it. When we come back from the break, Representative Louie Gohmert. I'm going to just sit back and let him let us know what's going on from not only in Washington, D.C., but some of these other issues, and maybe have some comments about a few of these Supreme Court decisions, because there have been some very significant ones that, as a lawyer and as a former judge, I know he wants to weigh in with as well. So let's come back. And again, members of Congress don't always control their lives, but we hope we'll have Louie Gohmert with us in just a minute. And then I'll get back into a couple of other issues that I want to put out there in terms of the fact that a lot of these corporations, they want to say, we're really concerned about racism, we're really concerned about inclusion, and I want to give you the percentages of the African Americans that actually work in those corporations. I think they need to lead by example before they start telling us how to lead our lives. Let's take a break, though. The matching fund is still on the table. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recently, the president of iVoter Guide explained on my radio program how COVID shows how elections matter. Debbie Withnow said that COVID reminds us that elected officials can make life and death decisions. Now, it may be tempting to think that elections are just politics. We learn from various orders and pronouncements, however, by elected officials that they have significant power over our lives. She also argued that COVID revealed how vulnerable our religious liberties are. Some elected officials singled out church services for special sanctions. Legal organizations were busy trying to defend churches. Also related was the reality that COVID revealed how vulnerable our civil liberties are. A lone surfer was fined. Police ticketed 22 people in cars watching the sunset. A man was arrested for playing t-ball with his 6-year-old daughter in a park. On the other hand, she noted COVID also showed us that many officials still support religious and civil liberties. Many elected officials pushed back against the irresponsible edicts. Judges even struck down some of the most blatant acts of bullying. Unfortunately, politicians use the pandemic crisis to stuff special interest pork into laws meant to help average Americans. These bills were also used to funnel money to wealthy universities and the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. COVID also showed that politicians' worldview matters. We all agree that saving the lives of the elderly and at-risk people is something the government should do, but that same concern for life did not extend to the unborn. Abortion clinics were kept open because they were considered essential services. The pandemic was a reminder of how important the November elections will be. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And again, we're in the last day of our fiscal year, June 30th. So if you can help us out, of course, we have a matching fund on the table, but we have an opportunity now to talk with Representative Louie Gohmert, serving in the 8th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 1st District of Texas. He is a member of the House Judiciary Committee. How we've enjoyed watching some of that unfold. Before he was elected to Congress, he was a district judge in JAG and a number of other things, a graduate of Texas A&M University and Baylor School of Law. And Louie Gohmert, it's been too long since we've had you on the program. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Kerby, thank you, and thank you for all you do, man. You are making a difference. This is such an important year. People have got to figure out which way we're going to choose, and that's not following a particular political party. It's do we take the narrow way and follow the teachings of Christ, or do we take the broad way? And I am so proud to know you and to just love what Point of View does. You help spread truth, and that's what matters.
I might just mention that we posted just a video that you had done, an interview that you did with Newsmax, about 7 minutes long, and it takes us into the pandemic, the coronavirus, deportation, and a number. But for just a minute, let's, if we can, maybe talk about the Supreme Court. Today we had a victory for religious liberty. Feel very good about that. Chief Justice John Roberts seemed to be on the right side this time. But we've also seen some having to do with everything from transgenderism to DACA and a number of other things. So we always have kind of a mixed bag, but I think as you were talking about the future, I'm sad that so many policies are essentially decided by the Supreme Court. That's not what the framers intended, but the reality is it also causes us to pay attention to who we elect to the United States Senate, on who they were going to confirm to the Senate, through the Senate, the judiciary, and even the Supreme Court, and of course who we elect as president. But what about some of these decisions that came down?
Well, I've been tempted to send Roberts some hand cream, some moisturizer for his hands, because they've got to be getting dry from all the times he sticks his finger in the air to see which way the wind's blowing. That seems to be the way he's making his decisions. The man was trained carefully on the Constitution and the original intent. And ever since the Obamacare decision, where he reportedly was going to vote to overturn it, but then got squishy because reported that he kept getting indirect word that if you reverse this, you will be the most political Chief Justice since Dred Scott. And the misinformation he got caused him apparently to just give up on honest, truthful, factual, constitutional decisions. So it does seem, if you're trying to justify why he goes one way one time and another way another time, it does seem to be he sticks his finger up in the air to see, which way the populist wind is blowing. And yes, unfortunately, he's guessing wrong on that.
Yes. Well, again, we've had everything from homosexuality, abortion, transgender, whatever, religious liberty. So it's been a mixed bag. And I think it just illustrates, again, what's at stake in the future. But let's talk about the present. We have a coronavirus. I've heard that you've tested negative, which is good, because I think every once in a while people get upset that you're not always wearing a mask wherever you go, but you're
right,
healthy. And talk about Texas, because why are we seeing so much of an uptick in some of this? Maybe you have some thoughts.
Well, I do have some thoughts, and first of all, thanks for bringing that up. I get tested pretty regularly, and I'm negative each time. And last week, even added the antibody test, and the doctor said, not only do you not have it, you've never had it. So there is that. So the mask, if I wear one, it would be to protect myself from all these other people that might have it. But I'm not afraid of them. I'm not afraid of getting it. If I were to get it, then I would be wearing a mask because I would not want to spread that. But in the meantime, it does seem to scare people. But I'm amazed. We've never had American people where the government quarantined or put limits on well people. In the past history, they were quarantined on people that were known to have, whether it's tuberculosis or polio, things like that, trying to protect people. But this time, we've basically put different types of quarantine on people who are completely healthy, and in fact, even making them close their businesses, even though for some it meant going bankrupt and never being able to open. That's completely new in American history.
One of the things I've seen you talk about, and I haven't heard anybody else mention it, so either the press got it wrong or maybe you've got something that I don't know, is that we look at some of these border states, and with the exception maybe of New Mexico, certainly California, Arizona, Texas, and even those that come into a state like Florida, some of the infection may be coming from outside of the United States. What have you found out?
Well, there's no question. We've had people come into the country. Of course, early on, when people were coming from China, especially Wuhan province, the disease was brought in here, just like planes of Chinese coming in to Italy, especially people coming to northern Italy, where the fashion center. They brought in the Wuhan virus. We brought it in here, but there's no question there have been people come across our southern border illegally who have brought a whole number of diseases. And so, anyway, it is important that if you're going to be a healthy country that helps other countries get healthy, you really need to protect yourself and keep yourself as a nation as safe as possible. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to help other countries. So it is important. And, of course, Louisiana was really hard hit. They had a lot of people coming in to Louisiana and brought the coronavirus. So they had a very early spike. And in East Texas, the counties that are right along the border with Louisiana, even though they don't have comparatively that many people, they do have a little higher uptick. But if you look at the numbers for Texas, yes, there's more cases. But if you look at the percentage of fatalities from the number of cases, Texas is a little bit down, and from where they were, way down from where New York continues to be. But so yes, there's an uptick in cases. There are more tests being given, but you can't help but wonder, where are the most people gathering and most likely to be spreading disease that can be transported through, particles of spit in the air? Well, gee, that would sound like protests and gatherings where people come out together, because we're seeing the uptick in numbers of young people, which is a little different. But then again, you got a lot more young people than old people that are getting together, and whether it's protests or having parties, whatever. So
just about out of time, but I wanted to give you a chance if you wanted to challenge any of our donors, any of our listeners, to maybe become donors. Maybe is a better way to say it. Any things that you might say just before I let you go?
Well, I have to be careful because the rules of ethics don't allow me to tell people to give to certain things. But let me just say that Point of View is a program that broadcasts truth and broadcasts the truth of Jesus. And if this country is going to be saved, Point of View is showing the way. And I'm so grateful to you and the staff there at Point of View. I love being there in person even more. But I'm just so grateful, and I hope today is a wonderful day, because we just don't just want you to continue what you're doing. We desperately need you to continue. So, Kerby and all those at Point of View, thank you so much. And I hope today exceeds your expectations, but that's going to take people acting.
Well, again, Louie Gohmert, always great to have you on the program, and I need to let him get back to the people's business. But again, if you would like to know more, go to the website, pointofview.net. Of course, the pledge line, 800-347-5151. Representative Louie Gohmert, looking forward to the next time we get to see each other face to face. God bless.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I have some more to talk about. First of all, he was talking about the elections. My commentary today, Viewpoint's commentary, is COVID and elections, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's open up the phones if you'd like to join the conversation. This would be the on-air line. It's a different number, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, two of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow we have James Herzen and Alveda King and Rick Scarborough and just a number of other individuals. But just before we wind down this last half hour of Point of View, I wanted to bring Warren Kelly into the studio. He's president of Point of View. I guess we had some miscounting of some numbers and everything, so I'll see if we can try to clarify all that. I'm glad I'm on this side of the microphone, and that's your job over there. But explain what's going on.
I apologize. We have a good number of our staff are working from home because of the COVID situation. And so we had some overlap in the counting between staff members in different locations. And so last hour I told you that we had hit 41,000 towards our match, and we actually were at about 34,000. We double counted some funds that had come in. So we are now up to about that 41,000 number where I told you we were an hour ago, but we still got a long ways to go. Tonight is the end of our fiscal year, and we need to hit that $100,000 mark to close out the fiscal year where we need to be. We do have two matches, as we've explained before. Foster Freeze surprised us on the air last week. On Thursday, he gave us a $50,000 match and told us that we needed to match it by the end of the year. But before the end of the segment, when he left the show, he told us that he would extend that out a little bit to July 15th. So
then we may need it now.
And we really need it to come in this fiscal year, which is today. But we do technically have until the 15th. But the other match, the other $50,000 match that we found out at the end of the day on Friday, that match expires tonight at midnight with our fiscal year. And we are still significantly short of that mark. And so we definitely need to get at least there so we don't lose those funds. But then we also have to reach the other 50 for Foster. And so bottom line is we need to hear from those of you who have not yet called.
Yes.
Or not yet gone online to give.
And I really want to just get all of it done today because, we have so much. I don't think anybody loves talking about money, but at the same time, if we can get that in, then we'll be focused on all of that. And like I said, tomorrow, just in a kind of an incredible number of individuals that we have planned, and we've got the rest of the week planned out already. So that's kind of the idea. So thank you for the update. So 41,000.
41,000. And let me again encourage you, if you're going to give, if you can give today, that would help us. It would help count towards our fiscal year. You can put it in the mail. If you like Kerby and I that prefer just to write a check, it's P.O. Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. And if you can get it postmarked today, that would be great. But it will still be matched with the other part of the match if it's a few days later, provided we haven't already met the match.
Okay. So, and if that's hopefully not too confusing, you can always talk to Warren Kelly off air if you want to do that. Well, thanks for coming in.
To help.
And again, we'll try to give you an update probably tomorrow. I guess that'd be the best time.
Yes.
We'll have a pretty good idea. And I'm just sorry we double counted, but I understand how that is because there's only a handful of us in the studio area. Everybody else is working from home. So I could see how that would happen. Okay, let me just mention real quickly that if you go to the website, you've got the one that I mentioned on the woke culture comes from college, the one about abolish Amazon. You just can't make this up. Preparing for another pandemic. That, of course, was Chuck Bentley's, and we have the video of Louie Gohmert. We also have one on swing states and voter rage, and that is a Victor Davis Hanson piece. Just in the interest of time, maybe I won't get into it in much detail, but it is illustrative of the fact that we're starting to see a much more divided country, as if we could make the country any more politicized and divided as it is. But you can see the differences in terms of the way the pandemic was handled by various groups and governors and mayors and others. You can then see when we started having first the protests and then the riots between public order and mob rule. And so in some respects, those very significant national events are going to also, in one way or another, determine who you elect as the next president. Let's recognize that by sometimes, if you will, some of the thinnest of margins, President Donald Trump, or at that time candidate Donald Trump, won in, say, Wisconsin and Michigan by very small votes of 10,000 in one, 27,000 in another. That may sound like a lot until you realize how many people voted in the millions. And so the swing states are going to be important. And when you see these various polls right now that show Joe Biden way ahead, of course, a lot of people just say we don't like Trump, so we like that individual, even though we don't know, even some of the policies that he would want to implement. We'd even know, how coherent he might be, given some of the concerns that have been surfaced. And of course, it's a long way between now and November. But if nothing else, I wanted to post that article for you to read as you look at, because I think Victor Davis Hanson did a good job of kind of setting forth the different issues and his argument. And it's not so much in this article, but in a previous one, it says, you got people angry on both sides. You got the people out on the streets angry, but you got a lot of Americans watching this fearful or angry as well. They may not be marching in the streets. They may not be holding signs. They may not even tell the pollsters who they're going to vote for because they don't want somebody to overreact to something that they say, but they still are going to have a vote on November. So that's another part of that idea of voter rage that I thought I might mention. But just before we get into a couple of other issues I wanted to put on the table, my Viewpoints commentary today is called COVID and Elections. It's not probably how I would have titled it, but that's how Debbie Withnow, who was on the program with us, who is the president of iVoter Guide, talked about that, because she was really arguing that there were a number of ways in which this pandemic and the lockdown really, in some respects, are going to affect the election. And she talks about the fact that, for example, that reminds us that elected officials can make life and death decisions. If you listen to Point of View, you know that we've seen that in many cases, the tendency for people to say, does it matter who I vote for mayor, county judge, anybody like that? And yet those people were making very important decisions about your life, issuing orders and pronouncements. So in some respects, it, I think, illustrated how much more important it was to not only look at who's at the top of the ballot, but go all the way down to the bottom of the ballot. She also pointed out that this pandemic and the lockdown began to illustrate maybe how vulnerable our religious liberties were, our civil liberties were, and we've given so many examples of that, both with Kelly Shackelford and just even of people being ticketed for being in a car watching a sunset, or a man being arrested playing t-ball with his 6-year-old daughter in a park. But on the other hand, it also showed that there were other officials that were pushing back against some of these irresponsible edicts. And so it just illustrates again that you're going to have to pay a lot more attention to people that are controlling your life. Another example she used was politicians were using the pandemic crisis to stuff special interest pork into laws meant to help average Americans. And that's been one of the great shockers. I think we've always known that the way they make sausage, as they say it, they make laws in Congress, isn't pretty. But when you start seeing money that was intended to help individuals or businesses going to wealthy universities with huge endowments or going to the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, you can see how that was the case. And the last point that we make is that this pandemic, as well as the lockdown, really helped us understand why we need to pay attention to a person's worldview, because we recognize that saving the lives of the elderly, people that are at risk, is really something government should do. But we then noticed that the same concern did not extend to the unborn, for example, or to particular groups. And we saw that essential services included, everything from marijuana distributors and abortion clinics and liquor stores, but oftentimes did not apply to churches. And so, again, there's some really important lessons we've learned from this. And if nothing else, I think it really has kind of exposed, in many ways, some of the remarkable differences in America. I've got a commentary coming out next week in which I point out that this pandemic and lockdown really kind of exposed the differences between the left and the right in terms of stay-at-home orders, in terms of what would be acceptable political protest and what would not, or whether or not we should spend lots of money or be really careful how we spend the money. And so in some respects, we live in a world where the pandemic isn't the problem as much as it is shown some of the problems that have existed for some time. But let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time. Jim Garrity today talked about the convenience of anti-racism as a corporate brand identity. And what he was getting at is the fact that we'll give you just a couple of examples of corporations and businesses that talk about, we're really concerned about racial equality. We really want to have diversity. We really want to have inclusion. And then I'll give you a few of the percentages. And I think they're raising some very good questions. But I would certainly hope that they would learn to lead by example And sometimes they're too busy wagging their fingers at us, telling us how systemic racism is part of the problem, when you look at their own company, corporation, or whatever, and you kind of say, maybe you would be better not throwing some rocks if you live in a glass house. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, you've heard people make the statement before, when you start tearing down statues and start renaming things, where does it stop? And I think the answer is it really never does. And I thought I'd just give you a few examples of why I don't think it's ever going to stop. Jim Garrity today talks about the convenience of anti-racism as a corporate brand identity, and first talks about the fact there's an editorial came out arguing that George Washington and the founding fathers, because they owned slaves, we should just completely remove their name from everything. Now think about the state of Washington, Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial. You know, you go down that list, and it's really hard to imagine. And even there, he talks about the fact that all of this is really symbolic gestures, actually, instead of trying to solve real problems. A lot of this conversation started over the death of George Floyd. Over the last couple of weeks, we've tried to give concrete suggestions about, should we reconsider qualified immunity? Should we reconsider police unions? What about the Justice Act that wasn't even allowed to be debated in the United States Senate, and all of the rest? And you can roll your eyes at the fact that, for example, Golden Girls had one episode where these women have mud masks, but because that could be mistaken for blackface, Hulu's decided to remove that episode. Or that Dungeons and Dragons don't want to be seen as judgmental, so now the evil races are redefined, apparently, the orcs and the dark elves and that kind of stuff. And the renaming of products, Eskimo Pie, or the renaming of various music groups, the Dixie Chicks now, I guess, are just the Chicks. And then you have the attempt by the corporations to say, okay, we want to show that we really do believe in this issue. So Mercedes, for example, announced that it's going to have an all-black car in the 2020 Formula One race. And they said, this is our pledge to improve the diversity of our team and our sport, and a signal of the team's commitment to fighting racism and discrimination in all its forms. But then somebody pointed out that the company's Formula One workforce still only has about 3% minorities, of any minority, much less African-American minority. Then you have Warner Brothers and the CEO of Warner Brothers declaring that racism is a problem and that they are really wanting to do what they can to make sure that they can really be a model for diversity. And yet then you can find the link that says, like many companies, it's less diverse the higher you go on the corporate ladder. Well, let's go to Bill Gates. Okay, he's been in the news a lot lately, and just the other day on Twitter, he says, I'm committed to listening and learning more about systemic racism, what I can do with my actions and words to help create a more equal and just future. And so as a result, this is a man that was the richest man in the world for a long time, from 1995 to 2017, and yet the workforce and the worldwide staff of Microsoft is at 4% black. Well, just one more to get the point across. Marvel Studios, they again have a very high-profile pledge. We stand against racism. We stand for inclusion. We stand with our fellow black employees. But then you had Anthony Mackie, who plays Sam Wilson the Falcon, who is one of the few African-Americans, by the way, in most of the Marvel comics and everything, said, I've done 7 Marvel movies where every producer, every director, every stunt person, every costume designer, every PA, every single person has been white. He said, we've had one black producer. His name was Nate Moore, and he produced, of course, Black Panther, which is the one exception. But do you get the point? I mean, there are all sorts of statements being made all the time about this. And so the renaming is supposed to also take place with the various military bases. Ann Coulter a while back said, no one who hears Fort Hood thinks of General John Bell Hood. Fort Bragg, how many people even know that the home of the 82nd Airborne is technically named for General Braxton Bragg? And yet that's the kind of stuff that is happening. And we've been told now that not only do all the leaders in the Senate, but even apparently Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he's okay with changing the names of the military bases. And if we're going to do that, I just gave you a couple more examples. How about Yale University? The namesake, not only a slave owner, but a slave trader. And it's gotten even more bizarre at Princeton. Now, first of all, I happen to agree with this decision that they've decided at Princeton University that the former president of Princeton, who later became the president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, they've taken his name from the School of Public Policy and the Residential College, because of his racism, which, by the way, you would have probably first heard about here on Point of View when we talked about it with Dinesh D'Souza. I think most people probably don't even know that. So now everybody's having fun with this. Governor Bobby Jindal, for example, said, now that Princeton is canceling Woodrow Wilson, can we cancel his federal income tax as well? Because, of course, the income tax was passed under Woodrow Wilson. Andrew Osborne said, yes, and that's when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So can we now get rid of the Federal Reserve, which has turned every American into a slave? And so as a result, you're having people now suggesting that, I know, maybe what we could do is get rid of the federal income tax, get rid of the Federal Reserve, because all that happened under a racist president, Woodrow Wilson. And, of course, I'm ending with a little bit of humor, but not much, because this is, again, the illustration that we have made and others of you have said as well. Once you start down this road, there really is no end. And even as I pointed out, this idea of deconstruction, it's the idea of moving forward. Even the present needs to be expunged. We need to forget the past. We need to actually defund and remove the present. And so we need to abolish the police. We need to abolish the prisons. And one of them was we need to abolish Amazon, and we need to abolish the present. And it has gotten that crazy. And this is, I think, ultimately going to be the campaign issue in 2020. People are going to say, do we want more of what we see in the streets today, or do we want to go back to some level of order? Can we acknowledge that we've had some sins in the past, but we are doing a good job of providing more and more than we've ever done before? Are we improving? And those are, I think, are going to be the big decisions that are going to be front and center for us here in this 2020 election and in the rest of the 21st century. Well, we're simply out of time. And again, we are ending our fiscal year in about 9 hours, and was hoping that we could just finish it off there. So all I could do is report tomorrow that we made it. And if we don't, well, it looks like we have one extension, but we still need to finish off the other one. So that's where we find ourselves. So if you'd like to help us out, we would greatly appreciate it. As you go to the website, pointofview.net, you're going to find all the articles I've mentioned about how the woke culture has come from the colleges into the society. This idea of abolish Amazon, that's just bizarre. Preparing for Another Pandemic by Chuck Bentley. A good video by Louie Gohmert, and the impact of the swing states and voter rage. And those articles are all available at the website. And, of course, my COVID and elections commentary is there as well. But also, just before we go off the air, let me mention that even though we're going off the air, we'll still answer some phone calls. I know there's some people here waiting to take your phone call. That number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Of course, the website is open. And, of course, if you want to write to us, it's Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Well, let me just mention tomorrow that we're going to be talking with James Herzen, and we'll get into some of the things happening in Hollywood. Alveda King, the niece of Martin Luther King Jr., and Rick Scarborough are just a couple of the guests that we have coming up tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to a great Wednesday program. We've got also a very good one on Thursday, and I think we might actually run a 4th of July tape on Friday. But first of all, let me thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Journalists are supposed to be all about facts, but today's national media seem more interested in creating hysteria and outrage based on false narratives. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And today is a day that will greatly determine Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020. Today is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership will help us set our budget for the coming months. And now, 2 of our friends just agreed to match what you give up to $100,000, doubling your personal impact. With so many big events ahead, we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Take a moment right now and double your gift by joining the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Again, today is the last day of our fiscal year. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.